Brutal radio message from Lewis Hamilton during Monaco practice. Stay until the end only if you want to hear Hamilton's unexpected radio message that the whole world heard, and the brutal consequences that await him. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. The engines howled with unrelenting savagery, mechanical beasts pushed to the brink of their engineered limits, their voices merging into a deafening violent orchestra of combustion and control. Every gear shift cracked like a rifle shot in the dense, shimmering air, each downforce sculpted machine carving brutal lines across the tarmac in a ballet of violent precision. The asphalt boiled beneath blistering tires as they clawed for grip in every corner, every straight, every millisecond of opportunity. The fans were no longer spectators, they were part of the storm. They screamed not in unison, but in chaotic chorus, driven by passion and fear and thrill and disbelief. Faces blurred, flags waved, hands clenched. No one sat, no one blinked. It was not a race, it was a battle waged at 300 kilometers per hour, a war fought in microseconds. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. The Ferrari cars, those iconic red symbols of history and hope, stormed forward like blood cells surging through veins made of carbon fiber and titanium. Their movements were poetry, their aggression art. From the outside, it looked like dominance. Controlled. Intentional. But there was an uneasiness behind the spectacle, a friction beneath the surface that couldn't be seen on the timing screens or heard in the commentary. It wasn't about positions or pit strategies. It wasn't the weather or the tires or the track temperature. It was something else. Something deeper. A change. A presence. A storm waiting to burst. The broadcast continued with its usual rhythm. Camera drones danced overhead. Commentators waxed lyrical about sectors, DRS zones, ERS deployment. But none of them caught it. None of them felt the split-second shift in the air that preceded the crack of thunder. None of them noticed the silence that pierced the maelstrom like a scalpel. It came from inside a cockpit. One voice. Controlled. Measured. Absolute. We've got this. It was calm in the chaos. And then, if we fix the start, we'll dominate. It didn't sound dramatic. It didn't sound revolutionary. But in that moment, in that frequency, it was the equivalent of dropping a grenade into a cathedral. 12 words. A sentence that didn't just cut through noise, it rewrote context. Those who heard it, the engineers buried in data, the strategists hunched over monitors, the silent minds behind the curtain, they felt it like a tremor in the bones. Not because of what it said, but because of who said it. Lewis Hamilton. The interloper. The legend. The man who hadn't even been at Ferrari a full season, and yet had already started slicing through layers of dogma that had calcified over decades. In the command center, something changed. It was subtle. Not panic. Not chaos. But stillness. The kind that settles over a crowd right before someone says the unthinkable. The kind that precedes confession or revelation. Engineers sat frozen mid-type, their eyes staring into monitors but no longer seeing numbers, only questions. Strategists, once smug and secure in their philosophies, suddenly found themselves re-examining fundamentals. Hamilton hadn't delivered an update. He delivered a diagnosis. A verdict. A warning. It was clinical. It was surgical. It was devastating. For years, Ferrari had built a fortress around their way of doing things. Pride ran deep in Maranello. Tradition ruled. The red machines weren't just cars, they were mythological creatures, crafted with the breath of Enzo himself. And now this man, this outsider, this champion from rival lands, had walked into their temple and pointed out the cracks in the altar. Not with fury, not with disdain, but with clarity, precision, truth. The garage felt it. The technicians, the tire handlers, the telemetry analysts, they all felt it. A tension like a storm front pressing against the walls. They heard the words over and over in their minds. If we fix the start, we'll dominate. It didn't matter that it was true. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that someone had said it aloud. That someone had seen it. The ripple effect was immediate. Meetings shifted tone. Data review sessions became quiet debates. Subtle disagreements turned into unspoken rivalries. Was Hamilton here to help, or to take over? Some saw genius. Others saw arrogance. And in between those two poles, a new silent fracture began to form inside the team. Not one born of hatred. One born of uncertainty. Of fear. Hamilton didn't push. He didn't lecture. He simply performed. In the car, he delivered laps so clean they felt manufactured. Every turn-in was calculated. Every lift, every application of throttle, every micro-adjustment of the steering wheel, it all communicated one thing: mastery. And mastery, at that level, is intimidating. Especially when it starts to expose flaws in your system. Leclerc noticed. Of course he did. He wasn't just watching his teammate, he was studying him. Silently. Obsessively. The telemetry overlays didn't lie. The margin wasn't huge. But it was surgical. Just enough to question yourself. Enough to make a man wonder, how does he do it? How is he always there, perfectly placed, perfectly timed? And then came the most dangerous question of all: should I change? Inside Ferrari, the hierarchy blurred. No longer was it about number one and number two. It became about philosophy versus precision. Instinct versus engineering. Leclerc was passion, flashes of brilliance, emotional highs and crushing lows. Hamilton was structure, an evolving machine, absorbing data, adapting, perfecting. And in the tension between those two forces, Ferrari was being pulled apart. No one said it aloud. But everyone knew it. The mood changed. The music in the garage felt quieter. The radio calls more cautious. The smiles more forced. Everyone began second-guessing. What if he's right? What if we've been wrong all along? What if the key to unlocking Ferrari's future lies not in holding tighter to their legacy, but in letting it go? The next race became more than just a race. It became a test of faith. In the garage. On the pit wall. In the simulator. And in the hearts of two very different men wearing the same shade of red. One represented what Ferrari was supposed to be. The other represented what it might need to become. And the car? It was no longer just a machine. It had become a battlefield. Between tradition and revolution. Between emotion and calculation. Between silence and statement. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. 12 words started it all. And the echo hasn't stopped. In the dimly lit confines of a private debriefing chamber buried deep inside the Ferrari motorhome, hours after the roar of the engines had faded and the grandstands had emptied into silence, Lewis Hamilton sat across from his race engineer. The air was thick with intensity, not the kind born from panic or defeat, but of purpose, of reinvention. Monitors flickered in the half-light like command terminals in a bunker. Data metrics cascaded down every screen: tire degradation curves, brake thermal windows, torque distribution overlays, sector-by-sector analysis with brutal honesty. This was no ordinary debrief. It wasn't a checklist of what went right or wrong. It was a forensic autopsy of potential. A rewriting of Ferrari's DNA. The room, silent except for the quiet clicks of keyboards and the faint hum of cooling fans, was less a meeting room and more a crucible where a new ideology was being forged. Hamilton didn't speak with volume. He spoke with gravity. Every word landed with the weight of experience and intent. He wasn't there to massage egos or tiptoe around Ferrari's culture. He was there to rebuild it. From the inside. Piece by piece. He examined the telemetry not for comfort, but for confrontation. Brake where consistency wasn't just a number, it was a symptom. Energy recovery dips weren't quirks, they were red flags. He questioned decision trees, challenged old assumptions, poked holes in long-standing strategies that had calcified into rituals. He wasn't just dissecting the car, he was dissecting the mentality that built it. This wasn't about adjusting wing angles or altering fuel mappings. Those were surface-level manipulations. What Hamilton brought was deeper. He demanded philosophical overhaul. He spoke of flow-state driving in high-pressure sectors, of synchronizing pit strategy not just to track position but to psychological momentum. He talked about turning the race into a mind game Ferrari could dominate, if they dared to think differently. He asked questions the room hadn't dared ask in years. Why were they settling for podiums as victories? Why were they still fearing ghosts of past failures? Why had this team, this empire, become so comfortable surviving instead of conquering? The silence in response wasn't disinterest. It was reflection. Shock. For some, even shame. For the first time in a long time, they were listening. Not because he was Lewis Hamilton, the 7-time world champion, the global icon, but because he spoke the truth. Truth that was uncomfortable. Truth that was necessary. He wasn't pointing fingers, he was pointing forward, inviting them to dismantle their mental constraints and chase something reckless and pure again: domination. Not through arrogance, but through reinvention. Not everyone agreed. Back in the garage, the energy was different. Tense. Combustible. Engineers gathered around laptops, gesturing toward data screens, arguing lines of code and lap delta interpretations. Strategists clashed in whispers that rose to frustration. It was no longer about tire strategies or pit windows, it was about ideology. A cold civil war ignited within the team. One faction clung tightly to legacy thinking, to the deeply embedded protocols that had guided Ferrari for decades. To them, the brand's sacred identity was built on tradition, discipline, methodical progress. Deviating from that was sacrilege. The other faction, emboldened by Hamilton's vision, saw those same traditions as shackles. Beautiful, storied, nostalgic, but shackles nonetheless. Hamilton had struck a nerve, and that nerve began to pulse violently. One group argued that Ferrari's past was a roadmap. The other shouted that it had become a straitjacket. Meetings became battlefields. Every setup adjustment now carried ideological weight. Every driver debrief became a proxy war for the soul of the team. The calm, methodical rhythm of the paddock was shattered. What emerged in its place was something electric, dangerous, alive. It all culminated in one moment, one flashpoint that made the entire paddock hold its breath. It happened without warning, without prelude. A revised setup sheet, radically altered, unexpected, aggressive, was leaked to a rival engineer. A setup that defied Ferrari norms, that bore the fingerprints of Hamilton's influence. Shorter gear ratios than usual. Brake bias set aggressively forward. Traction maps modified to favor mid-corner throttle surges. It was bold, reckless, and perfect. Whispers started in the Red Bull pit wall. McLaren eyes narrowed. Mercedes engineers exchanged looks. It was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just an overnight tweak. This was an ideological shift made real, visible, and terrifying. A setup that wasn't just different, it was audacious. The message was loud and clear. Ferrari was no longer playing defense. And then came qualifying. The world watched. Tension saturated the air like a thunderstorm waiting to snap. Leclerc strapped in, expression unreadable, jaw set like a man about to leap off a cliff. Cameras zoomed in. Commentators held their breath. The SF-25, once a machine of inconsistencies and compromises, now looked coiled, ready, feral. The first sector time dropped, and jaws dropped with it. Sector 2, clean, precise, ruthless. Sector 3, perfect. No corrections. No hesitations. Purple, purple, purple. Across the line. Pole. By a margin that didn't just suggest speed, it screamed transformation. This wasn't just a lap. It was a manifesto. The paddock, in stunned silence, watched as the timing screens blinked confirmation. Reporters sprinted. Engineers stared. Mechanics raised eyebrows. Hamilton stood just behind the wall, nodding, not in celebration, but in validation. What had begun in a quiet room filled with flickering data had exploded into a new era on track. The storm inside Ferrari had spilled onto the circuit. And the rest of Formula One suddenly realized they were no longer racing against the Ferrari of yesterday. They were racing against the Ferrari of Hamilton. And nothing would ever be the same again. Hamilton, stalking behind Leclerc with the precision of a sniper and the patience of a chess master, waited for a window that didn't exist. Not on paper, not in theory, not in any simulation Ferrari had ever run. But he saw something in that moment, a flicker of opportunity carved from nothing, and without a second's pause he lunged. No dramatics. No margin for error. In a section of the circuit where overtaking was not just rare but almost sacrilegious, he made it look inevitable. He glided past Leclerc with surgical grace and devastating finality, the way a blade glides through silk. The world caught its breath. The crowd rose in a wave of disbelief. The broadcasters lost composure, their voices cracking under the weight of what they had just witnessed. But none of that mattered as much as what happened inside the Ferrari garage. Because in that one move, Hamilton hadn't just overtaken a teammate. He had detonated the illusion that this was still Leclerc's domain. There was no contact. No chaos. Just cold-blooded execution. And yet, it carried the weight of a coup. The message it sent was not coded or veiled. It was thunderous and unmistakable. The baton had been seized. The hierarchy had shifted, not through politics or favoritism, but through sheer force of will. Hamilton didn't wave. He didn't look back. He just disappeared into the distance like a prophecy unfolding in real time. And behind him, Leclerc's silence said everything. He wasn't just passed, he was eclipsed. When the race ended and the engines fell silent, there were no fireworks in the Ferrari garage. No clapping. No champagne being sprayed with reckless joy. Just a suffocating, unmistakable stillness. Because those on the pit wall knew the truth. They had just witnessed something irreversible. This wasn't about a podium finish or a data sheet showing improved sector times. This was about the tectonic shift in the culture of their team. This wasn't about a race anymore. It was about the trajectory of an empire. Hours later, away from the flashing cameras and celebratory noise of other garages, Hamilton sat down in a dimly lit room at the heart of Ferrari HQ. No press. No entourage. Just a handful of people, strategists, engineers, decision-makers, those who could greenlight not just new parts, but new mindsets. The walls were lined with telemetry printouts, tire degradation curves, brake wear metrics. The air was thick with anticipation, but Hamilton didn't fill the room with theatrics. He didn't need to. His voice was low, almost measured, but each word landed like a strike against the granite foundation of old Ferrari orthodoxy. He didn't come to suggest or hypothesize. He came to change everything. He didn't just want more support in qualifying. He made them confront the truth they had avoided for years. He said, if we fix Saturdays, we dominate Sundays. Not occasionally. Not in perfect conditions. Every single weekend. It was more than a demand. It was a manifesto. These weren't the declarations of a driver lobbying for personal comfort or marginal gains. These were the words of someone who had built dynasties, who knew how to turn raw potential into generational dominance. It wasn't about balance sheets or incremental upgrades. It was about identity. About shedding the fear that had gripped Ferrari since the days of near misses and fading title hopes. About releasing themselves from the ghost of what they had been and embracing what they still had the power to become. And those in the room didn't argue. They listened. Because something had changed in them too. They saw what Hamilton saw, not just the faults in the car or the inefficiencies in race strategy, but the deeper fracture in their culture. The hesitancy. The need for consensus. The tendency to protect the myth of Ferrari rather than evolve it. They saw that the future wasn't going to wait for them to catch up. It was going to leave them behind unless they sprinted toward it with everything they had. And sprint they did. Quietly, relentlessly, the mood in Maranello began to shift. Meeting agendas changed. Engineers who had grown used to top-down instruction were suddenly being asked what they needed to win. Sim data wasn't being dismissed. It was being pored over. Alternative setups once rejected on tradition alone were now being tested with real curiosity. Because if Hamilton was going to bleed for this team, they were going to meet him halfway. And so a different kind of Ferrari began to take shape. Not the romantic myth-laden giant shackled by expectation, but a reborn beast that dared to shed its skin and become leaner, hungrier, more ruthless. A team that no longer whispered about potential, but shouted about execution. And at the center of that evolution stood Hamilton, not just as a driver, but as a catalyst, a force of nature, a disruptor of inertia. Leclerc, watching all this unfold, knew something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't just Hamilton's pace or his feedback or his public poise. It was his gravitational pull, the way the team had started to orbit around his vision. But even Leclerc, in moments of solitude, admitted to those closest to him that this wasn't some hostile takeover. It was something else. Something more complex. He had spent years carrying Ferrari on his back, through chaos and crisis, through failures not of his making. And now, finally, the burden was being shared. It didn't feel like defeat. It felt like momentum. Like a storm that might carry them both forward. And that's what makes this story so compelling, so volatile, so impossibly human. Because it's not just about lap times or trophies. It's about transformation. About what happens when an institution finally listens to its most radical voice. About what happens when leadership stops asking for permission and starts demanding results. About what happens when one man walks into a room and flips the script, not with ego, but with clarity. This isn't Hamilton's team. This is Ferrari, unshackled. And that might just be the most dangerous version we've ever seen. From the moment Hamilton first turned the wheel in the red of Ferrari, something in the sport shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was seismic. He didn't just arrive as a driver hungry for one final chapter. He arrived as a force of change, disguised in poise, wrapped in legacy, driven by an unshakable vision. He wasn't here to adapt to Ferrari. He was here to elevate it. Every corner he attacked, every tenth he hunted, every telemetry graph he dissected, it all served a purpose far deeper than race results. Hamilton wasn't just trying to win races. He was unearthing a new standard, one that Ferrari hadn't fully understood for years. He was redefining what excellence meant inside Maranello's walls, not as a concept, but as a requirement. Mediocrity? Not tolerated. Comfort? Not allowed. Excuses? Not entertained. The atmosphere around him began to shift almost instantly. Mechanics who once second-guessed decisions now executed with quiet precision. Engineers who once operated with caution began to think aggressively, to dream bigger. There was no more space for doubt. Hamilton didn't demand faith, he created it. His presence alone was a constant reminder that greatness isn't accidental. It's engineered, crafted, earned. Team meetings transformed. What used to be cautious reviews turned into war room briefings. Every voice mattered, but every word had weight. Strategy sessions once clouded with hesitation turned crystal clear. Direction replaced indecision. Confidence replaced chaos. People weren't just doing their jobs. They were chasing destiny. And that energy? It became contagious. Even Leclerc, once the emotional core of Ferrari, began to shift. Watching Hamilton operate was like witnessing a masterclass in composure and focus. There was no grandstanding, no melodrama, just relentless pursuit. And in that pursuit, something inside Charles began to change too. He didn't have to be the solo savior anymore. He had a partner, an anchor, a rival who didn't compete with ego, but collaborated with intelligence. The synergy was unspoken, but it was unmistakable. The ripple effect reached the factory. In Maranello, where once whispers of regret and legacy hung heavy in the air, there was now urgency. Purpose. Wind tunnel tests gained sharper meaning. Simulator sessions stretched longer into the night. People weren't clocking in. They were contributing, building, committing, not to the past, but to the future. And yet, under all this momentum, a question lingers in the shadows of progress. Will Ferrari truly allow itself to evolve? Can it shed its skin of nostalgia, its obsession with golden eras, and step fully into the unknown? Or will it flinch, just as it always has, at the precipice of transformation? The challenge isn't just mechanical. It's cultural. Ferrari has long been a team chained to its own myth. A place where legends hang on the walls like ghosts, whispering caution. But what Hamilton has brought isn't just speed. It's defiance. Not against history, but against being trapped by it. He doesn't fear those ghosts. He learns from them, then surpasses them. And so now, Ferrari stands at a crossroad not defined by lap times, but by identity. Will it embrace this relentless, uncomfortable path of reinvention? Or will it retreat to the safety of romantic failure? Because make no mistake, what's happening here is bigger than Hamilton. Bigger than Leclerc. Bigger than any one car or title. It's about the DNA of a dynasty either being rewritten or buried. The storm is no longer on the horizon. It's here. And it wears number 44. He speaks softly but works like a titan. He doesn't talk about what's possible. He makes it so. He doesn't chase legacy. He builds it. And if Ferrari dares to follow him, to truly follow, then what comes next might be nothing short of historic. If you're still here, you're not a casual fan. You're living through a metamorphosis. You're not watching a race weekend. You're witnessing the moment Ferrari stopped surviving and started becoming. Hit that like button not for us, but for every person in red finally daring to dream without fear. Drop your thoughts below because your voice matters in this new chapter. Subscribe if you believe this isn't the end of Ferrari's story, but the beginning of a chapter we never thought we'd read. And turn on notifications, because what's coming next isn't just a battle for podiums. It's a war for the soul of Ferrari. And you're not just here to see it. You're part of it.